Good evening. I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation. We spoke a little bit in the green room about what I hope that we will be able to cover. And just to kind of give some structure for where I hope the conversation will go. This is a book that has 7 or 8 chapters, each of which outline an area where the United Kingdom has either a competitive advantage, has been great, could become great for the benefit of its own citizens and make a positive contribution in the world. So it's a extremely thoughtful and timely book. It's also written by a person who's occupied 3 very important cabinet portfolios, and I think is thoughtful, represents a kind of progressive, forward-looking wing of his party, which is probably why he hasn't become the leader of that party. And I think is therefore to be taken really, really seriously. And so I really look forward to this conversation. And I want to start, if I may, on migration. You have a whole chapter devoted to it. And it's an area where I think we might robustly but civilly disagree. And so I want to start because I think we agree. I want to sort of establish the kind of core areas of agreements. And I think it's really, really, really important in the UK and in the world that this question of migration get resolved and settled in a thoughtful way, because I think Western democracy in some ways hinges on how we deal with this question, and civilized politics hinges on how we settle this question. So the first thing is, we both agree that migration is a net force for good.
Yes.
And it's useful just to go through it, because these are areas which I think it's useful to make the case for it. We need net influx of migrants to support our pensions, because we have an inverted demographic pyramid. We need migrants to help work in agriculture. You very wisely said in a book, a stat I didn't know, that 1/3 of UK Nobel Prize winners were born outside of the UK. So we get innovation and the best brains that come to our country as a result of it. Our NHS and our social care sectors would be difficult to run without migration. Immigrants are responsible for startups at a disproportionately high rate. They contribute to higher education, and they're far less likely to commit crimes than local citizens. So in a perfect world, you would have a controlled influx of migrants into the UK.
I'm going to let you finish your spiel, and then I'm going to respond.
Perfect. So here comes the question. Immigration is not a nice to have. It is an essential benefit to the future vitality and economic growth in the UK. And you say indeed, and this is the part where I think we'll disagree, you say when overall immigration levels are too high, fueled by channel boat crossings, the social consensus for the openness from which Britain has benefited for many years starts to fray. And the part that I disagree with is when overall immigration levels are too high, fueled by channel boat crossings, because there were only 35,000 people in 2024 who crossed, less than 100 a day in the channel, and 950,000 people legally immigrated. And in 2023, the number was 1.3 million. So less than 100 people arrive in boats a day, and 2,600 people or 3,500 people are legally settled. So we could admit every single person who arrived in a small boat in the UK last year and give them legal status, and we could do so for 23 years, and it would be less than the number of people who legally arrived. So it's incorrect to say that we have social consensus being frayed by people crossing the borders, because it's a tiny, manageable fraction of people.
Right. Good evening, and this is what's called going in at the deep end. It's a brilliant topic. Thank you for having me, Paul. And I can see we're going to have a really good discussion. But can I just I just want to frame my comments by saying that this is a positive and optimistic book. And I think we need cheering up as a country. I think we are in the doldrums. And basically, I started writing it after, when I became Foreign Secretary, you have this extraordinary, huge office, the grandest in Whitehall. And every Foreign Secretary, I'm sure David Lammy's the same, asks themselves a little bit secretly, they say, is this an imperial delusion? You know, I've got this office that's about the size of the British Museum, and are we kidding ourselves? And so when I stepped down, I decided to write the book to answer the question, and I wanted to answer it objectively. And I took the 8 biggest problems the world faces, from the future of democracy to climate change to migration. And I found in all of these areas that actually, out of 193 countries, you know, independent experts would say that the UK, without doubt, is one of the top 10 countries in terms of influence in solving these problems, often the top 5. So that's the context. This is a positive discussion. Now, on migration, I'm going to stick to my thesis in the book, but I'll explain, I want to explain why. So first of all, I think that for centuries, this country has flourished because we've been open to the brightest and best people from around the world. This is not a recent phenomenon. This is something that has been the case for many, many years. In fact, originally London flourished because it was where the Scots, the Welsh, the Irish and the English mingled, and we often didn't like each other very much, but you know, we learned to rub along, and then we welcomed the Huguenots and the Jews and the people from, you know, the Caribbean and you know, and then the EU, and this has made London the most international city in the world. I'm married to a migrant, and you know, I'm very proud of what it has contributed. And by the way, this is our future too, to be open to the brightest and best talent around the world. But I happen also to be an elected member of Parliament who, you know, clung onto my seat by my fingertips at the last election, and I knocked on a lot of doors. And I can tell you that the level of migration is scaring a lot of people for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that capitalism has not been good in this country, or actually across the West, in sharing evenly the benefits and opportunities that it presents. And secondly, we happen to have a big spike in migration around the time of the pandemic for various reasons. It came at the time that of Brexit, and the controls were set at a level that let in many more people than the government anticipated. And we had Ukraine, Afghanistan, Hong Kong at the same time, and we wanted to do the right thing for all those countries. But when you talk to people on the doorsteps, these are people typically on low incomes who feel that life has not been particularly fair to them, and they talk about the small boat crossings. And for them, this represents the incompetence and failure of the Westminster establishment. If you elect people who can't even control who comes into the country legally, then that creates in them a feeling that they're all absolutely useless, and I end up picking up the bill because I end up paying for the hotel, the asylum costs, all these things. And so, yes, you're right, in absolute terms, the numbers are small, but if in terms of the thing that is causing the social, and what I'm saying in this book is, let's solve this. Now, I want to be positive, because the truth is that this is not a British migration crisis. It is a global migration crisis. And it's caused by something incredibly positive. You know, when I was born in 1966, half the world's population were in what is defined by the World Bank as extreme poverty. That is an income of less than $1 a day. Just imagine if your income is less than $1 a day, even if you're in a country where things are very cheap, that is grinding, horrific poverty. Now, because of inflation, it's redefined as $2.15 a day. And the proportion over my lifetime has fallen from half the world's population to just 9% of the world's population. And by the way, in that time, the global population has nearly tripled. So this is the most extraordinary achievement of humanity that we never talk about. We have lifted 41% of the world out of extreme poverty at the time that the population has expanded. But with that lifting out of poverty, many of them have become mobile and able to travel in a way that just wasn't possible before. So that's a positive thing. But the reason that we find it very difficult to deport someone who comes to the country illegally is because the international law around refugees was written in the 1940s, and it was written with the noblest of intentions, mainly by Brits, to make sure that if there was another Holocaust, Jews would always be able to have somewhere to flee to. So we wrote, someone called David Maxwell Fyfe, I tell his story in the book, wrote the European Convention on Human Rights. Then we have the 1951 Refugee Convention. And what I say in the book is we need to rewrite this for a different world in which we have a globally mobile population. And I say there is one person who is supremely well qualified to do that, and that is the country that happens to have a prime minister who is a former human rights lawyer, who knows this law like the back of his hand, Keir Starmer. If Keir Starmer said we want to have a totally humane law that protects the rights of refugees, and protects, makes us a humane world in which we are there for people who are genuinely persecuted, but recognizes that we need to have better mechanisms to control economic migration, he would get huge support because all countries are facing these challenges. And I think it's something that Britain could and should take a lead in.
So I want to go back because I think that narrative glides. There's lots to agree with in that, but it glides over a central point which mistakes the sense that people feel that they've been left behind, that sense of inequality, that the model of economic growth we've chosen for the last 40 years has definitely left a group of people behind, and they feel very disaffected. And it's a common theme throughout your book, and you have great sympathy for that group of people, as we all should. But that group of people almost none of them have encountered a person who has come across in a small boat. And the people who have come across in a small boat are not impacting their lives at all. And they're not the reason why those people are poor and have been left behind. Those two things are conceptually entirely distinct. Because the illegal immigration that's occurred in this country is a tiny fraction of the legal immigration. And we agree that the legal immigration, by and large, is something that is a good thing. And the problem with not insisting on those two things, that allowing that trick of a light, allowing a person to say, I'm poor and I'm angry and I'm disaffected because people came across in small boats. It's got nothing to do with the small boats. One political party has staked its entire campaign on this issue and has dragged this country to a very dangerous xenophobic place. And we will not out-demagogue them by agreeing with their premise. And the Tory party is doing that. It's trying to outflank reform on the right. And if it does so, it will lose, because if people want demagogic policies, they want the full fat version of demagogic policies. They don't want the diet version that's being offered by the Tory party. And therefore, what has to happen is the case that you've just made, which is immigration is a force for good, and stop eliding the people who come across in small boats with the immigration question, with the reason why you feel poor and disenchanted. And wouldn't that be a more honest form of politics to say it that way?
It would be wrong. It would be wrong, Paul. And let me explain to you why. Our asylum costs every year are costing
10 billion.
Okay, 10 billion pounds. That's a penny on income tax. That is, money that really matters to this group of people. That it is not the case that there is no impact at all on everyone from the fact that we have this huge increase in these crossings happening. So I think, I am in the party that is currently suffering the most from the rise of reform. And I think that the way you tackle this issue is by saying, well, where is it that they have a point, uncomfortable though it may be? And it is the case that we have an inability at the moment to deal with illegal migration, and we shouldn't pretend that we don't. It has been growing, and we are not successfully controlling it, nor is France, nor is Germany, nor is Italy, nor are many other countries. And we provide the ground for populist politicians to come in if we fail to address those problems.
So we're going to move this off this, but I want to come to this 10 billion point, because the 10 billion point, I think, is also a fallacy, if you don't mind me saying so, for this reason. People are not poor and angry and disaffected, and haven't been so for a generation, because we spend 10 billion on putting people in hostels. That doesn't follow. We spend 10 billion on putting people in hostels because we have a crazy policy where we don't require people who arrive, or we don't permit them to work. Because if we did allow them to work, and we took that 10 billion and redistributed it to proper border security, I'd take 3 billion and invest it in border security. I'm a great fan of border security. The other third I would send to the French to allow them. We spend a pitiful 400 million a year over 3 years to get the French to take their obligation. We could spend it more wisely there. We could take some of it, and your book recommends it, to do development policies in North Africa, which I'm a great believer in. And then the rest of it we could use to give people skills, and also to invest in those communities. So why don't we just give people the right to work while they're having their policies, their asylum claims processed? And then if they're not a legitimate asylee, let's send them back. It's a self-inflicted wound to incur the 10 billion. And it's a policy of the demagoguery. It's a product of the demagoguery that we're subject to.
I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree. But I think the best way, if I may say, Paul, for you to understand why that wouldn't work, is to ask yourself why it is that all these people who arrive in Sicily want to make their way up to the UK rather than stay in Italy or France en route. And the reason is because it's easier to work here in the black market undocumented than it is in France or Italy. And if you said that people who come here actually have a right to work, we would see many, many more people trying to make that journey. And so, I think, anyway, the big picture is that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. I think the UK could unlock an international solution. I think that in the end, if we just take the view that we're going to pull out of the ECHR and the 1951 Refugee Convention, we will not address the international problem, which means that basically if you want to stop boats coming across the Channel, you need to work out how you're going to stop them coming across the Mediterranean. And my own judgment is that this is getting to a point where there is a risk to the wonderful generosity that has made this country the extraordinary powerhouse when it comes to education, innovation, science. And I want us to solve the problem. And there are many other problems, by the way, in there as well. But this is one where I think we could have a positive role.
Excellent. Let's move on to climate, because I think that your chapter on climate documents all the extraordinary ways that the UK has made progress, has decarbonized, has been a champion in so many different areas, and also said where the UK has a big competitive advantage. You've championed nuclear as a strategy, and today there's been a major announcement in this regard. But you've also said that one of the challenges is our route to net zero has not impacted energy prices, and therefore ordinary citizens have not embraced this net zero in quite the same way, or seen the benefits from it. So do you have thoughts, because we're in your Chancellor hat for a moment, on how you might be able to use the renewable revolution to positively impact energy prices?
Yes, I mean, look, Climate change is there's an independent organization that rates countries' commitment to climate change, and the UK comes third after the Netherlands and Denmark globally. And we've decarbonized by more than any other major economy. And it's interesting that there has been a consensus across the political spectrum from every prime minister, starting, and not many people know this, but it's in the book, with Margaret Thatcher, who was the first world leader who gave a speech warning about the dangers of man-made climate change. And by the way, she also said this is not a problem that any country can solve on their own, because you can't police your climate borders against other countries. So this has been something the UK has really done very well on. And I think this is a very important time for climate, because we know that President Trump does not have that commitment. He's pulled the US out of the Paris Accord twice. And the world carried on making progress during his first administration, and we need the world to carry on making progress second time round. But you were talking about populism. The bit of the equation that we've been very good on the altruism in the UK, but we haven't been very good on the economics. And we have essentially funded a lot of our good work on climate through higher energy bills, about 200 quid on the average bill. And, I look, if you said to me, how on earth are we going to pay for the NHS and all our needs on defence and all the things that we want to spend money on in the next 20, 30 years, there's a whole chapter on this. I think our big opportunity is to be the world's next Silicon Valley. Maybe we're going to talk about that, but we have the third largest tech sector after the United States and China. It's a big opportunity. But AI needs energy. These data centers need huge amounts of energy. And what the AI pioneers say is, we'd like to invest more in the UK, but, I had this conversation with Andy Jassy, he's the global CEO of Amazon. And he did announce, I wanted him to put one of his data centers in the UK. And very annoyingly, he finally agreed to do it when Rachel had become Chancellor. And so she got all the credit for it. But, and I'm making money by selling my book on Amazon. I mean, there's a few things going wrong here, but he did say to me, the first thing he said was, we'd like to invest in the UK, but your energy costs are really high. And if we're going to embrace this technology opportunity, we need to have much cheaper energy for business, and actually also for consumers. So given that wind power is so cheap, and we're getting, on a good day, we get 2/3 of our electricity from wind power, why is it that our electricity prices are set by the international gas price? I think there's some major reforms that we need to make. And I think in particular, we need to localize our energy markets a lot more so that we're getting much more energy generation nearer to where it's going to be used, because transporting electricity is a difficult and expensive process, and you can lose a lot of it along the way. So that's really my observation on that. Where I think it's sort of 8 out of 10, but if we wanted an A star rather than an A, then let's make sure we tackle these high energy prices.
And the nuclear announcement today is big progress in your mind.
It is, but I also did a lot on nuclear and announced some big funding for Hinkley Point when I was Chancellor. But when the Hinkley Point power station is open in the 2030s, I discovered to my horror that it will be the most expensive nuclear power station in the world. And you can build the same one in Hungary for about half the price. So we've got a big problem with our planning laws, which just make it incredibly difficult to build infrastructure. And this is something the government says it wants to sort out, and they will have my full support in doing so.
In the last part of your chapter, you cite Lord Nicholas Stern with approval in terms of his prescient report. And I think most of us agree that it's just plain economics, and history has proved him right. Why is it that the Conservative Party now has abandoned net zero?
We haven't. And, I think it's, what we want to make sure is that we don't lose popular consent for net zero by ignoring the concerns that ordinary people have. Reform has completely, they say the whole thing is rubbish. The truth is that they will they will have an audience for that argument if people feel that their energy bills are a lot higher because of it, which is why I think if you believe in climate change, we need to tackle this problem of energy costs.
So just to check, if you've listened to Kemi Badenoch in Parliament talking about net zero, you will come away enthused by this prospect, and you will think that there's full-throated support for getting to net zero by the Conservative Party right now.
Well, what she said is that, I'm not on the front bench, and I'm not going to get into the business of defending every single thing that everyone in my party says. But just for accuracy, she has said that she doesn't believe we will get to net zero by 2050. She has not said that we should ignore our climate commitments and responsibilities.
Okay. I want to talk about the spending review tomorrow. So the spending review tomorrow is going to have two big winners, if the press is right, defense and the NHS. And you cover defense as an important chapter in the book. If you sit back and say, if you were a citizen of the UK in 1945, and you were to think that in 2025 you would be celebrating the rearmament of Germany to the scale of 100 million plus euros, and think it's a good thing for the planet, it tells you that we're in a completely new paradigm. And you've spoken a lot about the new NATO commitments. And so I guess I want to ask you a question, because I think there's a general consensus that to defend human rights, democracy in Europe needs to shoulder a greater part of the NATO burden. And you may dislike Donald Trump, but that's been a byproduct of his urging. More money, as the Russians and the Ukrainians are showing us, doesn't necessarily mean more efficacy. So a $13 billion aircraft carrier isn't really necessarily fit for purpose, and 100 million F-35 can be blown up by a bunch of innovative drones put into trucks. So as the UK spends more money on defense, how do we ensure that that is productive for the economy and we're not fighting yesterday's wars?
Well, the sad reality is that the way that we will prevent war is by making sure that our adversaries don't want to take the risk. And this is a situation that we got wrong in the 1930s. We finally prevailed in the Cold War, but I'm afraid we have new adversaries today who are, as I think the Prime Minister of Estonia said, weakness is a provocation. And so none of us want to be having to spend this money, but we are where we are. But the interesting I talked about us being the world's next Silicon Valley. And the original Silicon Valley started in Stanford University when NASA and the Department of Defense were involved in the space race with the Soviet Union, and they wanted to, America wanted to make sure they didn't get left behind. And so, we actually have an extraordinary tech sector. There's things we can do to make it even stronger, but two of the three most important AI companies in the world are led by Brits, and one of them is based in London, DeepMind, extraordinary guy Demis Hassabis who set it up. And so what we need to do is to make sure that this funding doesn't all go to the big defense contractors, British Aerospace, Babcock, Rolls, great companies though they are, but goes to university spin-outs who are doing really interesting innovations, which are very often have fantastic civilian use as well as military use. And that way we make sure that we are discovering things like the drones, of whatever the next big thing is in terms of new technology. But I think the important thing to say is that the purpose of spending this money is to avoid war. And we have an adversary with Putin who is looking for signs of weakness, and that's why it's so important that he doesn't feel that the outcome of what happens in Ukraine is a win. By the way, there's a question about what happens to Taiwan. That would be another catastrophe for the world if Taiwan was invaded. Right now, if Xi Jinping is looking at what happened in Ukraine, he's thinking, this isn't going as well as you said it would, Vladimir, is it? 3 years on, you're still mired in this war, losing thousands of people every single day. Let's not do something inadvertently that changes that calculus. So I think there are opportunities for the economy, but it's a shame we've got to this.
You devote an entire chapter to human rights, and I think that's there were many instances in this book where your own personal advocacy, whether it was in the white helmets in Syria, which I thought was a very touching story of door-stopping Donald Trump and getting him to prevail via John Bolton to the Israelis, whether it was in Iran, whether it was with China, crossing them at a time that was perhaps unwise, but you did a really important intervention there, whether it was with Khashoggi, with MBS. And so there's a question that I've sort of interested in when you become a foreign secretary and you're a person who's genuinely interested and committed to human rights, which you absolutely, clearly, demonstrably are through this book. And then you confront the interests of the UK. So you go and see MBS, you scold or you raise the question of Khashoggi, and then we sell them arms or buy arms from them. I don't know which way it went. But and it sort of reminds me of that Groucho Marx thing, which is, I've got principles, and if you don't like my principles, I've got other principles. Which is to say, we need a more sophisticated way of weighing up the human rights question, because it feels like sometimes we have them, we personally have them. You very courageously intervened on ways that was amazing. And then when we practice statecraft, we sort of fold every time we see an economic opportunity or an instance of state interest. And it must be very, very difficult to balance that. So tell us your thinking.
It is difficult, but I don't think it's quite as bad as Groucho Marx. I mean, if I give you the example of you talked about Saudi and the horrific murder of Khashoggi, and I say in this book, I was the first Western foreign minister to meet the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia after this murder, and it was a very uncomfortable and difficult meeting. But we have a relationship with Saudi, which it's not just, for example, the jobs in the northwest of England in the factories that are building Typhoons that we sell to Saudi. That's a lot of people's livelihoods, and arguably those factories would close down without those orders from Saudi, because we don't sell them to very many other countries. But it's also that we share intelligence with the Saudis. They told us about a bomb that was on a plane that we intercepted at East Midlands Airport, and we defused the bomb and it didn't explode in the air. So you do have relationships with other countries that are for important things, and human rights really matters. So in the book, I pose the question: what do you do when there's a conflict here? So what I did with Saudi was I used the anger that we felt over the Khashoggi murder to put pressure on them to agree to a ceasefire in Yemen, where there was this appalling civil war. So it was in another part of the world, and I actually became the first foreign minister to meet the Houthis. And we did have a ceasefire. It didn't last very long, sadly. So those are that's the balancing act that David Lammy has to do now. And that's why, by the way, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, lots of people might say Keir Starmer should go to Washington and have a Love Actually moment and stand up to Trump like Hugh Grant does in that film. But he's absolutely right not to, because right now, the most catastrophically dangerous thing that could happen would be for Trump to pull America out of NATO. We've got a NATO summit in 2 weeks' time. The first time I met him was at the NATO summit in 2018, when he threatened. He had a big showdown with Angela Merkel, and he threatened to pull America out of NATO. And you know, we wouldn't be talking about 2.5 or 3% of GDP on defense. We'd be talking about 5 or 6% of GDP on defense without America and NATO. And so I think diplomacy is about compromises. But my feeling on human rights is, first of all, if you believe in freedom and democracy, then you have to care about any individual of any country who is being unfairly treated. And, you know, I think when it comes to, for example, political prisoners in China, my attitude was it may have absolutely zero impact when you raise that case with the Chinese leadership. It probably did have zero impact. But I can raise this as a foreign secretary of another country in a way that no Chinese citizen can. And I want the Chinese government to know that we do actually care about it. And it's not just going through the motions. And, you know, the reason I did that was because, you know, I remember a story about the meetings that Margaret Thatcher had with Gorbachev. And at the end of every meeting with Gorbachev, and this was someone that she really wanted to get on well with because she was trying to push him to do perestroika and glasnost and nuclear disarmament and all those very, very important things. But there was a dissident at the time called Andrei Sakharov. And at the end of every meeting with Gorbachev, she would say, "Oh, by the way, how is Mr. Sakharov?" And Gorbachev's face would fall. And sometimes she would say at the end of another meeting, she'd say, "Oh, I've got a book for Mr. Sakharov. Could you kindly pass it on to him?" And again, and, you know, who knows what influence that has. But I like to think that Gorby is thinking, why on earth is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom interested in this rubbish person that I've got languishing in a gulag somewhere? And what's going on here? Who are these people? And then it starts to get him to question whether it is actually right what he's doing. Now, that might be hopelessly idealistic. In the case of Gorbachev, of course, there was a good ending to that story, and who knows if there will be. But I think that's the only way, that the only answer with human rights. Sometimes you have to make horrible compromises, but don't do nothing. There's always something you can do.
Yes, and is there not if the other side anticipates that what one's going to do is raise the question, but then when it comes to their interest, one folds, don't you think they game us out after a while in the West? And that what we have to, for it to mean something, it's got to have consequence for them, and it's got to impose a cost on us. Because if human rights is just us rhetorically saying stuff, but we're not prepared to assume a cost, then we don't value it appropriately. And so, you know, I'm always torn between the personal courage of foreign secretaries who do things because they think it's the right thing to do, and a nation willing to pay a price for it in its bilateral relations. And isn't there a risk that we're too close to the former or not the latter?
Well, I think, you know, you have to be honest about the extent of your own power. So the reality is that, you know, China is a very powerful country. And, you know, if Keir Starmer only talks about human rights when he sees them, he just won't get to meet Xi Jinping anymore. They will just freeze us out. I mean, I remember that David Cameron was frozen out of all meetings with Chinese government figures for, I think, a couple of years after he met the Dalai Lama. And so that doesn't necessarily help your human rights agenda if you just lose all access. But I think there is always something you can do. It's different on different occasions. And sometimes with the really powerful countries like China, all you can do is let them know that you actually care. So, you know, we can't stop, it pains me to say this, and I wish it was different, we can't stop the mistreatment of the Uyghurs. You know, China is the second most powerful country in the world, and they are not going to listen to us when we talk about that. But we can bring the topic up, and they will ignore us, but they will also wonder just why it is that we want to use up political capital talking about something that for them is nothing to do with Britain's prosperity or influence, and that's all you can do.
And you have a chapter on health, and you are, unusually well equipped to talk about global health, having served as the health secretary, and you outline the ways in which the UK has been competitive, and then a set of areas where we could be investing more. I just had a breakfast with the head of the Wellcome Trust recently, and he revealed a staggering statistic, which was the reductions in USAID funding in the public health realm will lead to 25 million excess deaths, which is more than COVID, which was 18 million excess deaths. So the moment that we're in global health terms is despairing and incredibly alarming. And one of the things that you prescribe is working on antibiotics, working on vaccines, but also promoting new models of global cooperation. On the third one, can you tell us in this context what you think Britain ought to be doing and how we can help to fill the hole that's been left by USAID?
Well, it's obviously I don't agree with those cuts, let me say this. I mean, one of the big this book is trying to present solutions, and I think there are solutions, but you have to be honest about the things that have gone wrong. One of the things that's really disappointing in the last couple of years has been that advanced democracies have been surprisingly and impressively united in the defense of Ukraine. But we have failed miserably to get the support of African countries, South American countries, many Asian countries who just decided to stay neutral. And I think one of the reasons actually goes back to the pandemic, because in the middle of the pandemic, when the same person was president of the United States as is currently the president, in any other period, I think a US president would have had a global summit to say, how are we going to get vaccines out to the poorest countries? Instead of which, frankly, it was everyone for themselves. And so when we then wanted their help with Ukraine, I think countries in Africa said, well, where were you during the pandemic? So I don't think this is the right approach. But what can we do in the world we're in? Well, it just so happens that, the UK has, it's the Life Science Research Centre in Europe, probably the second largest in the world. There's an extraordinary industry developing new medicines centered around Cambridge. And I think there are some very practical things that we need to do. We need to be working on vaccines for a future pandemic. We got our COVID vaccine this time round. By the way, just an interesting little stat in the book. I know politicians and statistics and all that, but the Oxford AstraZeneca's vaccine saved 6.3 million lives around the world. We gave that free of charge to the developing world. That was a brilliant decision by a British company, AstraZeneca and Oxford University. Dexamethasone, which is, saved the lives of people in intensive care, discovered in the UK by Sir Martin Landry and Sir Peter Horby, saved 1 million lives. There is no country whose innovations saved more lives in the pandemic than the UK. I mean, we were absolutely remarkable. But now we need to recognize there was actually a bit of luck that we got that vaccine. We just happened to be working on other vaccines that were related to COVID, and we got one. But there are classes of disease where we have no vaccine. And the next pandemic could be one of those. So I think this is a big focus of effort. By the way, also potentially very lucrative as well, because these are big industries. And so I do think that's something we should be doing.
And you also make the point that the same set of technologies, when applied to antibiotic resistance, can in fact do innovations at speed. And, if you didn't like COVID, you're not going to like an outbreak of antibiotic resistant superbugs. And the UK can innovate and use its competitive advantage in those as well. I want to begin to wrap up and ask you a question about universities, because in your democracy chapter, you talk about UK universities as these extraordinary exports and imports. They attract 40 billion of capital. They allow the best brains to come here, and those best brains get to stay if we have enlightened immigration policies. And we're able to innovate based on them. but they're also a little bit under siege. They're, you know, the fees are capped in the name of social equity, but their balance sheets are not fantastic. The recent tweaks on immigration policies is going to make it harder for a certain category of students to come. So if you know, what would be your prescription of defending this remarkable resource, which I think anybody who's looked at them closely have said that they're under an enormous strain?
Okay, so I'm just going to rewind and just to explain why this is a really, really important final question. So I had to do this horrible autumn statement in 2022. I just become Chancellor. I had a black hole, a real black hole, by the way, in case Rachel Reeves is listening, of £72 billion. And I had like a month to fill it. Basically, this was not, by the way, caused by the mini budget. It was caused by COVID and the fact that we spent 350 billion quid keeping the economy afloat and families afloat, and you know, and then interest rates went up. So it was a real nightmare. And I wanted to give a bit of hope. So I put into my statement, look, we're going to concentrate on growing the economy, and our big opportunity is to be the world's next Silicon Valley. And I thought, I've just got to do this. And I thought this is going to get widespread derision. And it didn't. Interestingly, the tech sector in the UK were thrilled. And actually, I thought I would get a lot of British kind of, you know, oh, what planet is this guy on sort of thing. And I realized that the reason it didn't get this derision is because there are two things that are very unique about the UK, which mean that if we grasp the opportunity, we really could. I mean, we're not there yet by any means, but this could be a project over the next 10, 20 years. And the first is that outside the US, we have the biggest financial services sector. So these fledgling companies are able to attract capital from all over the world much more easily than they can in other countries. But the second thing is that outside the US, we have the most respected universities, 3 of the world's top 10 universities. And, you know, but actually it's not just, you know, Oxford, Cambridge and Imperial. It is a higher education sector that has thrived in the last 25 years. I'm going to say something that some of you will wince and some of you will be surprised about, but it was an incredibly enlightened decision of Tony Blair's to allow them to charge tuition fees, because actually that has been the start of, first of all, them being fully independent of the state, so that they weathered the austerity period much better than they would otherwise have done. But secondly, it has given them financial strength that they wouldn't have otherwise have had. And so that has been not popular with students, not popular with parents, but for the British university sector, which now attracts more international students than anywhere other than the US, 750,000 a year. This is an incredible thing. So this is our crown jewels, and the ideas coming out of that university sector, another hidden revolution that no one really knows has happened. But in the last decade, our universities have started funding spin-offs and spin-outs through their labs in, you know, the life science sector, creative industries, technology. They've started funding them in exactly the same way that Harvard, Yale, Stanford have been doing for years. If you look at the ecosystem around Imperial College, it's absolutely extraordinary. There's no difference actually between them and some of the Ivy Leagues. So this is a real revolution that is happening. It's a massive advantage for us. You know, President Macron is a very canny operator, and, you know, he's always trying to nick businesses from over the channel. But he knows he can't compete with that. That is something that we have, and is very, very difficult for others to innovate. So if there's one thing I hope, you know, if I sent Keir Starmer a free copy of this book, by the way. There's a letter to him in the back of the book. But if that's one thing he takes away, it is protect our universities.
This is indeed the last question. In 5 or 6 of your chapters, you talk about disaffection or inequality or unequal distribution in the climate chapter, in the trade chapter, in the democracy chapter, of citizens feeling a sense of left behind. And you intimated that you're writing a new book on economics. But I wonder if if you might end by giving some thoughts about how we can grow the economy, but also grow the economy in a way that promotes mobility and opportunity and erodes that sense of unfairness which is fueling populism, and without which, unless we erode that sense of unfairness, populists will win. And if you don't like populists winning, then just look what's happening across the pond and see if that's a movie you'd like to see in this country. So I think it's central that the key parties and the key thinkers articulate a vision for how we promote inclusive growth. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, I think that, one of the chapters focuses on free trade, which, as we've discussed, is one of the most amazing inventions, which, by the way, obviously comes from the UK, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, an extraordinary thing. But the truth is that as we've seen this incredible explosion of global prosperity, we haven't concentrated hard enough on making sure that we spread the benefits of globalization evenly. And you have a situation in the UK where it's actually worse than many other countries, where so much economic power is concentrated in London that productivity in Manchester is 40% lower than London. Productivity is what economists say is most closely correlates to living standards. But the median salary in Manchester is about £10,000 lower than the median salary in London. In Lyon, to take France's second city, the difference is not 40%, it's 20%. And in Germany, Munich is actually more prosperous than Berlin, and Tokyo and Osaka, it's absolutely identical. So we've not been good in this country at spreading our wealth around. So, and the levelling up agenda, what Rachel Reeves has announced this week about, projects for northern infrastructure, these are, in my judgment, really not addressing the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that we are the only country in the developed world where a city the size of Manchester has to bang on a door in London in order to get funding for a ring road or a new railway, rather than what they would be able to do in Switzerland or Germany or France or America, which is raise the money themselves or borrow the money themselves. And we have centralized political power in London in a way that makes it very difficult for people who live in an area and are passionate about the area to actually solve their own problems themselves. And this would be something that would really help to mitigate a lot of that inequality. So, I think capitalism is an extraordinary thing, but if people don't feel that they're going to get a fair crack of the whip, then it will be imperiled, and that is a danger thing for all of us.
So I'm now going to turn it over to you, and the mics that are roving, I'm going to implore you to ask a question, not make a speech. So please. Okay.
Thank you. Karina Robinson, the City Quantum and AI Summit. So obviously I'm in the quantum AI world, and I totally agree with you, Silicon Valley. Now, there were three things that made Silicon Valley so special. One was defense, as you mentioned, Apollo, DARPA, all of that. So we're getting more of that. The other was a loosening of the visa regime for clever graduates or pre-graduates from other countries. And the third was that India at the time was producing a load through its technology institutes, a load of people. Now, right now, we have an incredible opportunity, all those who no longer want to go to the US, to bring them here. But our visa regime, because immigration is seen as one broad spectrum and it's not differentiated, it's really difficult for the AI, quantum, and other companies to get visas. It's expensive and it's complicated.
Well, I totally agree with you, and we should definitely do everything we can to attract those people who want to move over here. But that's another reason why we need to eliminate the toxicity from the migration debate by showing that we do have a plan. By the way, there's one thing that Paul and I didn't discuss in our lengthy discussion about migration, which is that part of the issue is improving standards in our own education system so that we are better at developing homegrown talent. And I think there's a gap here which we don't talk about enough. So about half our school leavers go to university, and our state schools, some of the best in the world, and our universities are some of the best in the world. And I think that half of the population get a great education in the UK. But the half of school leavers who don't go to university, I think they would very often get a better education in Switzerland or Germany or Singapore. And I think making sure that everyone leaves with qualifications that enable them to make more money earn a decent wage in our tech-enabled world is a really important education reform we should think about.
At the back here.
Great.
Thanks so much. Charlotte Stockton. I work in education policy, actually, so interesting to hear you talk about that. But you spoke really interestingly about the role of a British Foreign Secretary and how you can raise certain issues in a softer way with governments, even if you don't think it will have immediate change, but it might do in the future. I'm interested to know, like, how do you decide when you can no longer engage like that and that you might need to intervene differently? Like, how do you know that, like, that soft diplomacy perhaps won't work anymore?
Well, maybe I can give you an answer that you'll be disappointed. There are times when you try the soft diplomacy, it doesn't work, and there's actually nothing else you can do because the country, your counterpart country is powerful and has just said, get stuffed, we're not listening to you, we're not interested. And I'm afraid that does happen sometimes. There are other times where you say, well, you're not listening. So, for example, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was in prison in Iran. And so I went to Tehran and met the authorities to argue that she should be released. They never, by the way, once in any of our discussions made any pretense that she was anything other than innocent. They knew she was innocent. Anyway, they did nothing. They wouldn't even let her see her own doctor, which is, particularly cruel, I thought. And then, so I then did the next step, which was I said, okay, I'm going to advise dual national Iranian Brits not to travel to Iran. That's what she was, because it's not safe. And that was something the Iranians didn't like because it was bad for their economy. I then gave Nazanin diplomatic protection, which was a kind of ratcheting up. So I was constantly trying to find ways to send signals to Iran that the status quo wasn't acceptable. Now that is something you can perhaps do with a country like Iran. It's much harder with a Russia or a China, bluntly. And that's where I think, in a way, you have the most sleepless nights. I mean, people like Navalny, when he was alive, he was one of the bravest men in the planet to stand up to Putin like that. What can you do to support someone like that? It's really hard, but I don't think the answer is nothing.
Thank you for that great talk. My name is Alex Haskell. I'm a lawyer at Salesforce Ventures. So my question is about housing. So I grew up in Los Angeles, lived in San Francisco for many years, and have lived in London for the last decade. And it seems to me that high housing costs are really downstream of so many social issues. Inequality, fertility, family formation, economic mobility, people moving to places where they can be the most productive, just general quality of life issues. And having been in the UK for many years, it's a huge problem here, housing affordability. And the NIMBYism in London is as bad as anything that I experienced living in California. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that and how to solve that.
Okay, well, let me try in 15 seconds, because you're absolutely right. It's a big issue. And I think in the UK's, first of all, things like rent controls, I think, are a big mistake. And they reduce the supply and they increase rents. So I don't think that's the answer. My own constituency is a beautiful rural part of Surrey. I grew up there. Most people would like it to stay the same, and they don't want new houses. But and therefore there's a lot of opposition to all the developments that happen. But if you say to people, if you said to people, we don't say this, if you said to people, look, we need young people to be able to get on the housing ladder. We need police officers, nurses, teachers to be able to live locally. We don't want to be a dormitory town just for people who work in London on high salaries. So we need to have some new houses, and you can choose where they go, and we can give first preference to people who grew up locally. You would change the dynamic. And I think you would find small villages actually thinking, where is the best place to put houses? And let's do that. And I think you would find, you would have cooperation because you'd be approaching in a different way, which is not what we have at the moment. So I think the answer to this question is to localize the problem, be completely upfront that there's a trade-off, and then ask people what kind of society they want to live in. I've asked that question in my own constituency, and everywhere I ask it, they say, yeah, sure. We'd be very happy to have more houses if we could say where they went and had some say in who got to live in them. And so I think that's, my view is that is the way to do it.
Hi, Sir Jeremy. My name's Leon. You could argue that one of the biggest reasons for the political and economic issues that the UK faces, but arguably actually across the developed world, are stagnant and in some cases falling living standards. Bit of a cheeky question, but if you were Prime Minister in 2029, like what are 3 policies that you'd bring in that would directly address those, but not things like building extra runways in Heathrow that might take 10 years, but things that in the near term you could see a benefit from?
Okay, I think actually, I'm trying to write positive books now that I'm not going to be Prime Minister. And so this one is about, how Britain can have a positive role in the world. And the next book, which I'm hoping will come out next year, is basically trying to show that economic growth is a solvable problem and we shouldn't give up on it. And productivity is the thing that all economists talk about. So I would say 2 things. First of all, I would say to Rachel Reeves, look, the state controls 20% of our economic output through things like, the NHS is about 10% of our economic output, and then other public services are another 10%. So that is productivity you directly control. And yet the public sector is appallingly inefficient, including the NHS. And why is that? Because we don't think about efficiency in the way the private sector does. Partly because you have much stronger unions. But what the private sector says is, look, we need people to be more efficient. We need to do the same job with fewer people. And we're going to invest in really smart IT systems that bring down the cost of delivering services. And in the public sector, whenever there's a financial crunch, the first thing that gets cancelled is the IT system. So, on Wednesday, we hear tomorrow there's a big tussle about funding for the police. I'm actually going to be looking for something that no one else is going to be looking for. What funding is there going to be for the police national computer system? Because that actually is the thing that will make the difference and mean that we can see crime falling for less money, but it needs some money up front. So that would be public sector productivity. Private sector productivity, I think it's the planning system that makes it very, very difficult for businesses to get things off the ground, not just runways at Heathrow, but pretty much anything you want to build.
Okay, and then I'll come to you.
Hi there, Mark Brooks-Wadham. Mine's a very short question. I think that when you look at most organisations, they either flourish or flounder based on the quality of the leadership. And I'd like to know when you're going to throw your hat in the ring to lead the party again, because I think we desperately need your motivation, your inspiration and experience. And I think the party is completely floundering at the moment.
Well, thank you for the generous thoughts behind the question, but the catch is that my wife is actually in the second row, and so this is a discussion for her as well as for me. But I've tried 3 times, and I failed 3 times, and so I think there's a kind of a message in there. But what I would say is that I think that politicians get an unfairly bad rap politicians from all parties, in my experience, are trying to do the right thing. But it's a really tough and challenging career. And, can you think of one prime minister whose time in office in our lifetimes has not ended in tears? It's really hard, actually, when you think back. And that's partly because we have a very lively democracy and we have a media that scrutinize politicians to death. But it is a really, really tough profession. So I'm going to stick around. But thank you for the lovely question. But I think the answer is no.
This gentleman here has been gamely putting up his hand.
Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Martin, a Conservative Party member, and in fact, I actually voted for you 3 times.
Thank you.
So I won't be giving you what's going to win the 2:30 at Wincanton tomorrow. And I also voted to remain. I'm a proud member of the Conservative European Forum. And while we are where we are with Europe, I won't go there. What in your book can you encourage me, give me optimism that we will have closer relationships with Europe? Certainly my father's generation went through a horrendous war. We were very keen on what Ted Heath did. That was a Europe that we were looking for. Can we look for that sort of Europe again?
I do talk about Brexit in the book, actually. And I think that the Brexit wars are one of the reasons for our national despondency, because you have people who passionately supported Remain, who think that we can never have a great future outside the EU, and people who passionately voted Leave, who say, the buggers didn't give us what they promised when we left. And so you've got 2 groups of very angry people. My own view, I happen to vote Remain as well, but my own view is there's nothing that stops us being a tremendous success outside the EU. We can be, we have a larger economy than Canada or Australia. We can be fully independent countries like them, but it's not automatic. It's up to us. And we need to remain the best of friends with our European neighbours, because this is a time when there's a global argument between democracy and autocracy, and people who share the same values need to work together. By the way, I would extend that argument to the United States. Trump isn't going to be there forever, and Trump isn't America. There's a lot of people in America who have a different view of America's role in the world, and in the end, people who are living in democratic countries. By the way, it's only 1/5 of the world now live in fully free countries. We are in a big minority. We need to put aside as many differences as we can and work together.
So I think we need to wrap, and I'm going to ask you a final question based on this, which is, I think you're such one of the things about the quality of democracy, if you look at the US, which is it's an increasingly hostile shouting match. The center has collapsed, and there's a deep sense of polarization. Now, that's not, the blame for that's not equally distributed, but it's the state of affairs. And in some ways, I think what you're hearing in this room, and the Conduit is a place which is seeking positive solutions exactly in the way that your book does, is we seek the best ideas, we're nonpartisan, and we're trying to get the best ideas to make Britain stronger, wealthier, more equitable, more sustainable, fairer, these things that I think come through in your book. And I think if you look at the direction of travel in the UK, and especially with the rise of reform, it places the Conservative Party, it gives tremendous responsibility to the Conservative Party to being a non-virulent, non-xenophobic, non-populist opposition. And I would love you to openly and honestly reflect as to whether you think the leadership of the Conservative Party right now is acting as a bulwark against it or pandering to it. And it's not just rehashing the immigration question, it's everything about a politics which is about a civility and not pandering to our base instincts. Because If it goes in the direction to try and out-demagogue reform, my wager to you tonight is it will be decimated in the next election, because you empower people when you pander to them and when you seek to be a demagogue adjacent. And I have a deep fear that that's in fact what's happening. People like you would pull it in a different direction, but what can be done to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, I'm going to stick up for Kemi, actually, because I think that I don't think anyone could have done a better job. It's been, it was our worst ever defeat in our history. We're down to 121 MPs. There was a message in there from the country. We were kicked out on our butts. And, in that situation, people aren't going to come rushing back. And, so this is a very, very challenging situation for any party leader. We also have had 4 leaders in 4 years. So I think to suddenly, at the first sign that things aren't going quite as well as you hope, to say, well, let's change it again, I think we would become a laughing stock. What I would say to her, though, is that I think we've had a year of, I don't think it's been a year of pandering, actually. I think it's been a year of contrition and a year of silence. And that was probably necessary. But we now need to move on to what opposition parties in our system need to do, which is from contrition to ideas and solutions. And that's what people want to hear. And I think there's this huge gap in the market in British politics. People are quite disappointed with Labour. I think, Keir Starmer's done well internationally, but domestically it's been a disappointment. People aren't seeing that solution with Nigel Farage's £80 billion of unfunded tax cuts. And they want to hear from a party that is actually thinking about what these solutions are. So I hope some of them, in terms of our role in the world, are in this book. But I'm a believer in this idea that you've got to get the substance right, and then the politics will begin to look after itself. And that's what I think we need to be doing. We need to be saying, not just we don't agree with Labour, we don't agree with reform, but this is what we should be doing here and now. And that I think is our path back.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.